Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. This week we're finding out about the unique and special Lough Carra, once renowned for its marl bottom which gave the water an alluring blue and aquamarine appearance. Not only that, but the fishing, and mayfly fishing especially, was pretty spectacular. But like so many things in nature, Lough Carra went into decline due to eutrophication. However, the loch has many interested stakeholders, not least the local communities, which have been vociferous and active in their attempts at restoring Cara to its once greatness. So, to tell us more, this week, Tom Byrne of the Lough Carra Catchment Association and lifelong angler joins us to speak about the special qualities of Lough Carra. And Tom, I believe the lake also has a special place in your heart.
Yeah, good man, Dara. Yeah, very much so, Dara. I used to boat on it and still do boat on it. But as Tom alludes to it later on, fishing isn't as fantastic as it used to be on it. And he does mention it. It was fantastic. I mean, I was just saying to you there, my dad had never fished. The first time I took my dad down to it in a July day in the mid-90s, we boated 10 trout. I'll never forget, we had a great day. No, they weren't huge that day, but we just fantastic fishing, just fishing wets in it. But no, it's just a absolutely beautiful lake. But and I was mentioning it to you as well. Tom touches on it. With the eutrophication, what has happened? It's not it's not as beautiful as it once was. He touches on the bottom there. So, and I think this is one of the reasons we wanted to do this, and to highlight about Lough Carra, and it's really great to chat to Tom, and as you said, that the work that's been done by the local stakeholders, and it's nice to hear him talk on what's been done, and give you a bit of hope after talking to him that sometimes things can be done and sometimes things can be turned around. It was just good, but no, the lake itself, love it. And funny, after talking, we now have another addition to the Irish bucket list for you.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to put up pictures. It's just when you see the pictures of that marl bottom, which has obviously been affected greatly by pollution, but when you see what it's like in terms of the aquamarine blue, it's so unique, like, and special. It's just it's not like anything you've seen, like, and I can only imagine what it must be like fishing over that. And as Tom describes, like when there's just fish, right? I think he said there was about probably about maybe 5-10% of what it was. Maybe is that what he was saying?
Yeah, just the recent surveys that have been done. Yeah, but it's just phenomenal. I remember when I started fishing first, you'd be looking out ahead of you, and you'd see green patches and blue patches, right? Okay, and I remember always been told, always fish the edge of them, and they'd be everywhere. Be green patch and the blue patch. I presume it's to do with just slightly different tinges on the bottom, but it actually worked. You would concentrate on these areas, and we touch on it there. I mean, the coloration was fantastic. I mean, they were like sea trout, and it is the chameleon effect, but also as well, to differentiate them from sea trout, on their back, that the back was kind of like a light olive hue to blend in with the back. Like you'd be playing this fish, and as Tom says, like the clarity, you could see the bottom, right? You'd be playing the fish and you would not see him. Right? And you could see your line going, particularly the maxima, you could see it right down to it, and you would not see him. And then when you release the fish, you'd see him darting off, and see, and then next thing, he's gone. Oh, just amazing.
Like a bonefish nearly, like, the freshwater Irish bonefish.
Yeah, I'll dig up, I think I was saying there, I think I do have a nice photo of one, just the back, going back, and we'll put it up.
Yeah.
We'll put it up when...
well, look, it's a great interview. Tom, he's a great speaker. He really goes into detail about the problems, but also about how people are addressing it, what they're doing about it, and he is optimistic for the future. Things change slowly, but he is optimistic for it, which is another great message to take from it. So look, let's hear from Tom Byrne now, who tells us why Lough Carra was and is so special.
One of the things that I'd like to say first is to refer to Lough Carra based on a description that I read in a book one time. And it was, it's Lough Carra. It's an old and ancient place. It rests at the northernmost tip of the Corrib system, and it's in the masterly sweep of Richard Hayward's book, The Corrib Country, to which I'm adding a few words that I think that we best find and captivate the alluring magic of Cara. He wrote as follows: that romantic and lovely territory of mountain and vale, law and island, archaeology and speleology, legend and history that extends 50 miles from Lough Carra through Mask and Corrib to Galway Bay. A strange ancient land that somehow is always under a light that never was on land or sea. But I suppose specifically in relation to Lough Carra, if you were going to trace its lineage, the best place to look is a book that's written by Chris and Linda Huxley, and the book is called Lough Carra. And it's an extraordinary book, but it really tells you about where Lough Carra is, what it is, and why it's there. It's the story, I suppose, of the great forces of our planet, the movement of tectonic plates, the shifting and displacement of land masses, changing temperatures. One of the things I think that's hugely significant is that Lough Carra sits on a great bed of Carboniferous limestone. And that's underneath the Cara, but it was formed 350 million years ago. And at that time, Lough Carra wasn't in existence. But the Carboniferous limestone was formed when Ireland was on the equator. That is an extraordinary, I think one of the most extraordinary things about the lake. And then I suppose subsequently the formation of Lough Carra you'd have to trace to the last great movement of ice over our country. It gouged out this large, shallow depression that filled with water and is now Lough Carra. And I suppose if you were to look at Lough Carra, sit on Lough Carra and walk around Lough Carra, what Lough Carra is about, it's about, in terms of our own history, it's about the story of the arrival of man, of tracks and signs of his passing over time, of posts that are driven into the bed of the lake 1,500 years before Christ was born. It's the story of timber causeways, of crannogs, of churches, of castles, of great houses, and the homes of our people. And I suppose what's significant in terms of this particular program is that throughout all of this time, centuries and centuries, Lough Carra has endured because of its great capacity to absorb and survive the change that we as people have wrought on its shores and along its streams. And today, when we're talking about Lough Carra, I suppose what we know is that the capacity of Lough Carra to survive what it is that we do around its shores is finite. And I'll just give you an example. In 1997, I moored a boat at the mouth of Partry Stream, which flows into Lough Carra, into a bay called Heenan's Bay, and I'm sure Tom is familiar with it. And in that span of time, that's merely just over 2 decades, the bed of the lake has changed from a beautiful, clear marl bottom. It was described in literature as being like the whitest snow. It has changed to a dark, brooding green of slime in many places. And that phenomenon that I have witnessed personally in the last few decades is consistent what's happening right throughout the entire loch, a very visible decline. And by what we do as human beings, we are placing the continued survival of this beautiful old place in direst danger. And that's the position we're in at the moment.
Tom, I have to say, that's the most eloquent and best introduction and overview to a fishery I have had the pleasure of hearing on this podcast over hundreds of episodes. So well done. If you weren't to say anything else for the rest of the show, I'd say that'd be more than enough. That was poetic and eloquent. It was beautiful, and it really put it into context, the history, the geography, the landscape, and everything to it as well. So what I was fascinated by, Tom, and especially when you kind of do a bit of research online, is the deep attachment people have to the lake. And the involvement that people are really, wanting to help out in terms of the Catchment Association, the anglers groups and all that. There's a real attachment there with the local community to the lake, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I suppose you can trace that back to the genuine love that people around this area who live along its shoreline, who fish its waters, the deep love and attachment and respect for they have for this wonderful place. Because we have to remember when we're talking about it that despite everything that has happened, Lough Carra remains the best example of a marl lake left in Western Europe. And it still retains significant lakeshore habitats with a wonderful diversity of flora and fauna. And it's one of a handful of lakes left in Western Europe that are designated wild brown trout fisheries of significance. There is only one lake outside of Ireland which has a similar designation, but tragically it is in decline. Lough Carra as well, I think it's so important that we remember that it's part of the huge reservoir of fresh water that is the Cara system, which supplies, our places of business, our schools, our hospitals, our homes with drinking water. I've traversed every single inch of Lough Carra as an angler. But one of the things that always has concerned me, looking at the way the lake has changed, is the effect that this could potentially have on human health. But it is never sufficient to say that the water we're drinking is safe when we continue to poison it. And the excuse we give for people that can drink it subsequently and say it's safe is that we add chemicals into it. It is our freshwater well. It is our communal well. And not alone is it beautiful, but it's sacred. And it's vital for the health of our communities that we preserve our drinking water quality. We're, of course, approaching this entire thing as anglers. And we know that any day you spend angling is a day well lived. And any day you spend angling in Lough Carra, particularly in the past, you know that you're in the middle of someplace that's absolutely beautiful, that's incomparable. But you also know that you're sitting on your well, that this well is providing our children, our old people in hospitals, our patients, our businesses, everybody with the water that we need to drink. And it reminds me of an incident that occurred many years ago when I sat on part of the Cara system with a toxicologist. Dr. Andrew Peterson was his name. And he identified at that time substances and particles in the water which were highly toxic. And at that time, I asked him, will that have an impact on human health? And I remember his response at the time was, yes, it will, Tom. We have studies which link what we're looking at here in your lake directly to specific human cancers within the human body. And I said, will it cause cancers in the human body around here? And I remember him saying, yes, it will. But it will never be traced to water. And it's one of the reasons why the community that I'm involved in, particularly the Lough Carra Catchment Association, identifies prioritizing water quality and the preservation and the return to good water quality as one of its primary objectives. We're not only saving this lake for posterity, we're saving it for human health. We're saving it as one of the best angling destinations in the world, which it once was. And its value cannot be measured.
I think that's so true, Tom, what you touched on there. And a very important point as well. I mean, while us anglers initially would have been concerned more, almost, I don't want to say this, but it's almost like kind of selfish. They were only just thinking of our fishing. A lot of us have now seen through this that it's a much broader picture than us just having a good day's fishing. It's a far more broad, and you've touched on it there. Like, we're sitting on our well.
Absolutely, Tom. It's so important. To the extent that many years ago, I went with a delegation of anglers and other people to the director of public health in Galway to raise these issues of concern that we had about deteriorating water quality and the implications for human health going forward. And I subsequently remember a conversation I had with a general practitioner, a doctor, many years ago in relation to cancers in our human population in this area. And the question I put to him was this: is there an increase in cancer in this area? This is going back 30 years, or am I imagining it? And I remember his response was, the word you're using, he said, is inappropriate. It's not an increase, it's an explosion. And I always was concerned that some of this could be linked to untraceable, immeasurable, unmeasurable, I should say, aspects to our daily consumption of this wonderful resource that is water. But anyway, that's a story for another day. I suppose when you look at Lough Carra really now, today, and you look at the challenges that it faces, we identified changes in Lough Carra going back 30 years ago and more. And it was the angling community that initially identified the changes, which were very visible. They were clear to the human eye. And at the time, we brought our concerns about Lough Carra and its declining water quality to the attention of the statutory bodies with responsibility for protecting our water. And we were told broadly that our evidence was anecdotal and therefore wasn't really that relevant. And on that basis, I remember over 30 years ago, we commissioned a study which established empirically that what we were saying in relation to Lough Carra was true. There were changes, they were significant, and it was due to the lake being polluted. The same sources of pollution are relevant today. And I must say that they have been acknowledged by the community itself that's largely responsible. That's the farming community. But in talking with the farming community, we always have to refer back to policies that were driven from Europe, which directed people in a very particular way to change the way they were going to farm on our lands and use our lands. And the essence of this comes down to the nutrient loading that we have put into our lakes. Effectively, what we've done is we've changed the way we've farmed from semi-natural habitat to specific growth of the perennial ryegrass, which is one species of grass. What that meant for our lake was that our land was reclaimed, natural habitat was removed, grassland was introduced, one particular species, biodiversity was destroyed in so doing, pollinating insects will not use the new grassland effectively. And in order to maximize growth in the grasslands, our farmers were directed by all the advisory bodies to pour as much slurry and bagged fertilizer onto the land as they could. And naturally, in the farming community did as they were advised to do. But the subsequent deterioration of our lakes, our water qualities, our water quality, our fishing, can be directly attributed to these changing agricultural practices, which were driven by European policies, which have absolutely destroyed our water courses and our lakes. Nitrates and phosphates are hugely responsible for the demise of our lakes. And it's continuing today, unfortunately. But it has been acknowledged by the farming community, who are now changing, thankfully, due to some new initiatives in their respect for the environment and in their response to the way they must farm, which is a hugely positive first step.
I noticed, Tom, as well, like that, there's been, negotiate or action and studies been done, with Law Pro, I think back since 2016. So what are we now entering the 9th year of that? Have things gotten better or worse in the intervening period?
In the intervening period, things are still in a state of deterioration, but there are signs of positive light being shone in particular areas. You're correct in saying that there are studies being carried out all over the lake. We have studies in relation to the plant life under the water, the plant life over the water, the plant life around the lake, the insect populations. We have fortunately got groundwater officer, surface water officer. We have an agri-environment advisor, and we have extensive studies, in particular in relation to water that's coming in over the ground and under the ground into Lough Carra, because we identify those water courses as predominantly the sources of pollution. They carry the pollutants to the lake. So at the moment we have the Geological Survey of Ireland, for example, mapping the catchment area to determine how far does the catchment area extend, where is the water coming into the lake, where are the sources of this water, and they're using tracer dyes to establish what's coming in, where it's coming in, what quantities it's coming in, and what effect it has on the lake directly. Allied to that, we've studies going on in relation to the marl crusts of Lough Carra. There was a Dr. Philip Doddy who did his doctorate, I think, in relation specifically to those underwater rocks and the crusts on the rock. And that's a very significant study, because what it determines is significant areas where the lake is deteriorating. The crusts that actually coat the rocks are being very heavily destroyed and damaged by pollutants coming in for particular areas. And one of the things that Dr. Philip Doddy did, which was very interesting, was he moved some of the deteriorating rocks where the marl crust was rotting to areas of the lake where the input of nutrients were not as significant. And what we discovered was that the marl crusts began to recover. And that is hugely significant in terms of identifying sources of pollution. But what we are able to discover is that the most significant sources of nutrient inputs, where they're coming from, and how best to deal with them. And I suppose in that regard, I'd have to refer specifically to the Catchment Association was set up, the Lough Carra Catchment Association, where a number of people in the local community who were concerned about how Lough Carra was deteriorating so quickly came together to do something significant about what was happening in the lake itself. And when you talk about the Catchment Association, I suppose what you're talking about is people from all walks of life who were interested in doing something constructive about the lake, recognizing that we needed to get community together and that we needed to bring people together of like-mindedness, not only people who lived around the lake, who worked around the lake, but people in businesses, people in our school communities, people in our scientific communities, people who are farming, people who are teaching, people who are involved in all walks of life. And all those people came together and wondered, what is it that we could do that would be significant to save our lake and to save the environment around the lake? And to do that, we had to first of all establish a method of raising funds. And it was with that in mind when we were talking to a gentleman from the National Parks and Wildlife Service that he said we should consider looking at the possibility of getting a project of significance on Lough Carra to begin to address its problems. So we looked at getting a life project. And a life project is something that can be very complicated to get. We sourced funds from Leader, significant thousands, I must add, and we got in touch with various companies that dealt with environmental sustainability. One of them was Woodrow Sustainable Solutions in a place called Tubbercurry. And we we eventually selected his firm of consultants to draw up an application that we could send to Europe to see if there would be a possibility of getting a life project going. Now, the documentation required to get that life project was significant, and it took a considerable amount of time and money to get it done. And our first application, where we were competing with countries from all over the European Union, was unsuccessful. But fortunately, we addressed the weaknesses in our application and subsequently submitted an application that was successful. We then drew in various statutory bodies, Mayo County Council, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Geological Survey of Ireland, Culture, and our own association as partners. And we successfully set up and got a life project going, Cara Life. And that has been, along with our own work as a voluntary group, that has been hugely successful in beginning a program of recovery and directing agricultural policy for agricultural practice in a different way in the catchment area of Lough Carra, to the extent that we now have 62 farmers who are actively engaged in programs funded by the LIFE project, which will change agricultural practices and will reduce the amount of nutrients entering our streams and water courses and the lake directly itself. And for us, that is a huge step forward. Now, it is only a pilot program, and it represents a small part of the farming community in our catchment area. We roughly would have about 480 farmers in the catchment itself. But this as a program with €5 million provided by European Union funding and a population that's not quite 10%, well, it's thereabouts, of the farming population, it's a great beginning. And the steps that they're taking are being driven largely by the agricultural advisor that we have on board in the LIFE project ourselves. Farmers are brought to meetings, they're talked to. The whole thing, of course, is based on a results-based scheme, which means that actions are identified which are beneficial to the lake. When the farmers complete those actions, they're directed in how to do so, they're paid to do so, their results of their actions are monitored, and payments are made subsequently on the basis of successful outcomes of the actions that they're required to do. All of those actions are reducing the amount of inputs into the lake and the water courses running into the lake. And for the lake itself, that is a huge gain. But one of the huge things that it's doing as well is that it's educating the community in the importance of the lake, in the value of the lake to ourselves, not alone as our wonderful well and our water resource, but also going forward as a great natural resource. One of the things that we know as brown trout anglers is that if you protect and develop a fishery, it is like a gold mine that constantly provides something that has a value. And Lough Carra is that gold mine. If we protect it, if we restore it as a premier wild brown trout fishery, people will come. Every business benefits around the lake, but the lake itself benefits. And we're on the way to doing it. Now, it's going to be a long, hard, difficult process. But one of the other aspects, I think, that's hugely important in relation to raising public awareness about the value of what it is that we have here is the lake is so wonderful and so beautiful, and people don't really appreciate the value of it. In order to increase what it is that people know about it, we targeted every primary school in the catchment area of the lake. We introduced programs, one of them based on a text called All About Water. And we talked to the teachers. They all agreed that the lake was of such significance that this program could be done as part of the environmental educational strategies within primary schools. They did it. It was successful, and it's an annual thing. We went into the secondary school, we did the same thing, and we have students from UCG involved in our lake and involved and making them aware of what it is that's happening. We have successfully produced a host of booklets that we've circulated to local communities and schools. We've booklets about flowers, about insects, about plants, about our catchment area, about the map, about the marl crusts, about the Cara Lake itself, its history, its archaeology, its water quality, its fishing, its community, its everything about our lake and its value. One of the reasons we're doing that is that we're completely aware that the generations going forward who are going to be protecting this place are the children in our schools and our families. And when you make children aware of the importance of what it is that we have here, that message goes home into the community. It goes to the parents, to the grandparents, to the uncles, to the aunts, and it spreads the news of the value of what it is that we're living beside, about its value to ourselves, about its value to posterity, about the fact that we're responsible for its protection, about the fact that it has lain here for thousands of years undisturbed and protected and beautiful, and the fact that we as human beings over the last 40 to 50 years, by what we've done, have placed the survival of this magnificently beautiful place in extreme danger. The message is being spread constantly. And the great thing about it is that we have people who are constantly engaged in spreading the message. And many of these people, and I have to pick out two in particular, and that's Linda and Chris Huxley, are so committed to the preservation of this place going forward that they've worked tirelessly over the last 6 years and engaged all the statutory bodies with their credibility and their scientific background and their concerns to broaden the importance of Cara nationally and internationally. And it's a battle that we're slowly winning. But what we're doing effectively is we're changing minds and hearts, and we're giving people the vision and the commitment, hopefully, when we're going forward. And when those of us who are a little bit older now and stepping back, bringing new generations into the struggle and the fight to save this wonderful place. And I think if we manage to do it, what we're doing will spread right down throughout the Corrib system, into Lough Mask and into that most beautiful Lough Corrib, right down to Galway Bay. And we can save everything, but we can only save it together.
I tell you, those words, they could be a mission statement, I think, for everyone in terms of local communities, because I couldn't agree more, because when it comes to engaging with the local stakeholders, with the schools, with the next generation, with the kids, with teachers, education, getting everybody involved and realizing the importance. And we're not just talking about angling here, but everybody who's locally living near it, in the catchment, just understanding. And like you said, it's about changing mindsets. And I think that's brilliant words. And you're right. We all need to start with maybe our own local, and then hopefully the message and the messaging and the strategy spreads from there. Fantastically put. Can we move it on to maybe more specifically then the fishing, Tom? Give us an inkling or an idea of how good the fishing was on Lough Carra.
On Lough Carra, I will. And I have to go back over 50 years when I was a young fella. Even before that, And I remember we used to come down from Donegal on our holidays here to County Mayo. We had a small little farm. I stood watching Tommy Heenan. He was an elderly man, well past the first flush of youth. And he was stooping and bending through the grass, hunting for crane flies and grasshoppers. And he was going to Lough Carra the following day to dap for trout. And all those years later, I moored my boat beside a great grey flagstone wall that was built as relief works during the famine. And it opened out onto a bay that was named after that beautiful old elderly man called Tommy. And the bay is called Tommy's Bay. And that began a passion for me as an angler, which has stayed with me to this time. And I remember he left 2 wonderful wild brown Cara trout into our house. I was only a boy. And I looked at these things in absolute amazement. And I was astonished by their beauty and astonished by just the wonderful fun that this man, as an elderly man, had on this lake as an angler. And we were living in Donegal at the time. And I brought with me that curiosity about lakes and fishing back to Donegal. And I was fortunate to live in a little town called Milford. And beside Milford, there was the most beautiful lake called Lough Carra. And we started fishing there as boys. And the lake had a huge population of wild brown trout. But at that time, it was one of the best salmon fisheries in Western Europe.
Wow.
It was a magnificent lake. People had competitions for salmon on the lake.
I believe that's right, Tom. There used to be actual fishing competitions for salmon.
Absolutely. And you'd need 5 or 6 salmon caught on the fly to win it.
That's gas.
And what size were the salmon?
Oh, anything from 5 pounds to 20 pounds. They were remarkable fish. But the lake was absolutely filled with salmon because it was on the Lennon system, which was a famous system at the time, and feeding into Lough Willie. But it was a remarkable place. And there was an elderly gentleman there at the time. He was a professional boatman. He boated for the local hotel, Milford Hotel. And he was standing leaning into a car one day talking to some men about fishing on the lake. And he said, "Hold on, lads, I'm sorry I have to go. The King of Belgium is waiting for me here." He was taking him out to boat on the lake in the day. And that was the start of, those were the sort of fishing clients that you had on the lake. It was magnificent. We as young fellas, of course, we weren't fishing for salmon. We were fishing for trout. And the trout were small. They didn't grow to the extent that trout grew in these great limestone lakes in the west of Ireland. But they were small. They were there in their thousands. You could catch 20 and 30 a day on fly. And it was just the most magical place. It was the most magical place to begin your life as a fisherman. So when I came down here, we moved here permanently from about 1980. And I began fishing on Lough Mask and Lough Carra. Lough Carra is here at my back door. And Lough Carra, over those years, was a magnificent place to fish. It had millions and millions of mayflies. I have never seen anything like the hatches of mayflies. The roads, the fields, the old church walls, the castles were covered in mayflies. Your car would be covered in mayflies. At night, the hatches of sedges were huge, and the fishing was extraordinary. You didn't have to be a top-class angler to catch trout on Lough Carra. They were there in their thousands. They were wild, they were beautiful, and they had survived there since the Ice Age. Because remember, Lough Carra and the limestone pavement that surrounded it was described in literature as an extension of the Byrne landscape. It was an ideal environment for trout to go big and to be beautiful and to be wild and to feed on the surface. It was just the most magnificent place. And we found, coming from Donegal, where the trout were small, these trout that we were catching in Lough Carra were, to us, they were like sharks. They were huge. They were magnificent. They were wild. And boy, when you caught them on the fly, could they fight? They were extraordinary. They were probably, I would argue, some of the best fighting wild brown trout in Ireland. And I'm sure Tom would agree because he'll have fished with them. But they were magnificent, and their coloration was unique. They were almost
Yeah.
like sea trout in their coloration. They were silver. They were beautiful. As they get larger, and if you were lucky enough to catch something over 5 pounds, you'd have that orange tinge on the trout. But they were there in abundance, and people fished for them regularly. I remember one time fishing the mayfly and counting on the what we described, actually it's south, but we always described it as the upper lake, around the Twin Islands in that area, 70 boats out fishing during the mayfly. And most of those boats were catching fish, and the population of fish was huge.
Can I ask you, the coloration of the trout, was that because of the bottom? Was it the
Oh, it
marl?
was because of the clear marl bottom. Remember,
Wow.
you could see to the very bottom of the lake before the discoloration. And I remember it being measured, clarity being measured with an instrument called a Secchi disc, I think it was.
Yeah.
And you could see down to the very bottom. As the lake deteriorated, how far down you could see lessened and lessened. You couldn't see down as far because the quality of the water was changing. The weed growth was beginning to become more extensive over the years, and everything was changing, unfortunately. But to give you...
It's funny you should say that. It's you mentioned the mayfly hatch, Tom, and I was fortunate enough one of the last proper seasons to fish it. And like, I fish on Cara, get decent hatches of mayfly, but it really opened my eyes. It was phenomenal. I'll never forget covering a fish, right? And by the time my false cast and I was covering the fish, there were already 4 mayflies in the wake of the fish that had just risen. I was going, my God. So I'm already down to a 1 in 5 chance of him taking me. That's if he stays in the same spot. But another thing there that you mentioned about clarity, back to fishing. I started fishing the Cara in the mid-90s. Cara is the reason I switched from brown maxima. I used to use brown maxima religiously, and then I went to Cara, right? And it was so clear. I was looking at this big brown rope with my flies attached to it, and I could see it from, I could see it after I did a full cast. And I came home from Cara after that day going, that's it, it's in the bin. And I started using clear nylon after that. But no, I was fortunate enough to see it. And you mentioned the mayflies. I can only imagine what it must have been like, because I only saw it for one day ever only.
It was extraordinary, Tom, because we weren't particularly great anglers. But I remember, I'll just give you an example of a day's fishing in Lough Carra. Bright sunshine, practically no wind, mayfly hatching, 2 of us fishing dry flies. We boated 24 wild brown trout.
Oh.
And I must admit, the vast majority of them we returned to the lake. We boated 24. That's not to mention the number that we returned. And another occasion, on one small drift, fishing dry flies, I boated 14 magnificent trout. I would have given them all back for the one trout that I missed, because he came up to the fly. He was the best trout I rose for the day, and I was too quick on him, Tom, and you know what that's about.
Pilot error, Tom.
And I lost the trout. But I remember going down during the mayfly, and I could see fish rising for hundreds and hundreds of yards ahead of me in the drift. And I remember the sensation of my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline flowing, and you didn't know which fish to cover. It was just the most magical fishing in the world. It was magnificent. And for those who've never experienced it, I think when we talk about it, they don't think that such a thing could have existed, but it did.
What's it like now, Tom? And do you fish it much?
In recent years, I haven't fished it as much as I used to fish it at all. I haven't fished as much owing to a lot of different circumstances and life-changing events and so on. But anyway, the fishing at the moment is very, very poor compared to the way fishing was. The collapse of the mayfly has been disastrous. The increase in chironomids at night is very significant too, and significant in terms of an indication of water quality deterioration. But the tragedy is that if you look at the number of trout we were fishing for in the year 2000, for every 4 wild brown trout that were in the lake that time, there is now 1. So the number of fish based on the surveys that we've looked at has declined, wild brown trout fish, by approximately 75%. So you're fishing for a smaller population of fish. You're fishing for fish which are a little bit bigger, well, a good bit bigger than the fish you would normally catch, which again is tragically a very bad sign. The fishing is slower. The fishing is much poorer. The mayfly fishing is negligible compared to what it was. The fishing at night for the great sedges, I kept a diary. And in one particular July, many, many years ago in the 90s, I went out 28 nights. Of those 28 nights fishing dry sedges, I caught fish on 27 nights. Now, that was nothing to do with my quality as a fisherman. That was to do with the number of fish that were in the lake and the number of fish that were there to take fly. And if you could throw out two big dry flies in front of you, irrespective of your quality as a fly angler, you were going to catch a fish. Now, when you go out in the bays where you'd see fish rising for hour upon hour, you could go out at 8 o'clock and fish at 1 o'clock in the morning and even later. Now you will be lucky to see, I would say maybe 5% of what usually used to rise rising now. It has gone to such an extent. Again, it's one of the great tragedies of our time. Can it be restored? I always believe in optimism and that it can, provided it's worked on consistently. I remember I was involved in the tourism angling measure many years ago when there was a development program on the Cara system. As part of that program, I spoke to the late Dr. Martin O'Grady, who was one of the most renowned experts in relation to water quality and fishing and everything that needed to be done to restore our fisheries right across Europe. He was magnificently qualified and a wonderful expert in the area. But in relation to the development of Lough Carra at the time, I remember speaking to Dr. Martin O'Grady. I said, Martin, we're targeting this lake with monies to restore the fishing and to help it again. And I said, what is it that we need? He said, Tom, there are two things you need in particular in relation to Lough Carra and this development program at the moment. Stream enhancement to its maximum potential, where you restore every single stream so that they can produce as many fish to the lake as can be produced. And the other thing that he said, which has become controversial in recent years, he said you need to reduce the population of the predator species in particular. And by that, of course, he was referring to pike. And subsequently, I watched as the lake was developed at the time, an extensive predator program and an extensive stream enhancement program. Those of us who fished the lake as fly anglers reaped the benefits of that wonderful program at the time that was carried out by the Western Regional Fisheries Board, as they were then known, and the fishing was excellent. It was absolutely brilliant. I'm convinced that a similar program at the moment, in conjunction with what the Lough Carra Catchment Association in particular are doing and the LIFE project is doing, would bring massive benefits to the restoration of Lough Carra as one of the best wild brown trout fisheries in Ireland. Now, one of the personal things that I have in relation to fishing is this. The Cara system, of which Lough Carra is a part at the very top of the system, is unique in Ireland. It's unique in Europe and it's unique in the world. Its restoration is hugely important. But I think it's a huge mistake that we have centralized the decision-making process for the development of our fisheries in Dublin. If in the morning you were to suggest to me, let's put the headquarters for the running of Dublin Bus in Ballinrobe or in Uachtarard or wherever it is that you live, you would see it as a massive folly. When we put the management of these wonderful wild brown trout fisheries in the hands of people who are located in offices in the middle of Dublin, it's a huge mistake. We need a management structure here in the west of Ireland to develop, protect, mind, and work our fisheries to their maximum benefit. If that were done, our system would be preserved and would become what they rightfully are and what they will be into into the future, the best wild brown fisheries in the world, because they are unique. But the fishing, I sort of am going off on a tangent there. The fishing on Cara can be restored. It is such a wonderful, beautiful fishery. And as Tom knows, any day you spend fishing a wild brown trout fishery, you sit in an island and have lunch, and you put your flies out in front of you to catch a fish. Your worries in the world are, am I going to get a fish? Am I on the right drift? Is the light right? Is the wind right? And it's a day that in anyone's lifetime is so well lived.
Here, here.
Very true.
Very, very true. Tom, I tell you, it's in good hands between yourself, the Huxies, all the Catchment Association, the groups, the communities, everybody that's involved in it and that are stakeholders in it. You know, I'm generally not a kind of glass half full when it comes to the future, when it comes to the environment and struggling fish populations. But my God, listening to you for the last 45 minutes or so, I have nothing but hope and positivity in terms of the people that are there to look after it. And I think most importantly, like you said, it's to consistently make the change, but also to consistently keep an eye on it. Because if you switch off at all, there's always the danger it'll revert back to old ways and old habits. So I think it's in safe hands. Before I let you go, Tom, and there's fascinating fishing stories you told us as well. And my God, one can only think about what the days were like. What was your most memorable fish on the fly?
My most memorable fish on the fly actually happened in a little bay called Ross Inver on Lough Melvin. And I was fishing for Sonhan at the time, and it happened to be in a competition. And I don't fish many competitions. But I hooked a fish, and I thought, now this fish is a little bit bigger than a Sonhan. And I thought, we're in a competition. It's got to be a salmon, and it's going to waste an hour of my time trying to land it. Now, the wind began to blow significantly, and it got to the level of practically a storm. And we were blown out over the lake, myself and my fishing companion. And I couldn't bring this fish to the surface. And I've landed quite a number of fairly good trout over my fishing career. But in this particular occasion, I couldn't move the fish. And the fish went down. And the boat began to move out of the bay. And the fish stayed down for 2 hours, which it never happened to me before in my lifetime. And when you consider that the fluorocarbon I had on was pretty fine, I was fishing 4 flies. This fish was on the tail fly, and I didn't know if it was a salmon or what it was. Now, I had an inkling that it might be a trout, because a salmon usually will throw itself up over the water when you hook it. But this fish didn't show. And after we were blown out over 3 miles across the lake. With the fish down, my rod bent to its full capacity. And after 2 hours, we boated the fish. My companion had to cut off the flies, the top 3 flies. Luckily, he was very skilled in a storm with the water. The rain was blowing into us almost horizontally, such was the force of the storm. But to make a long story short, we landed the fish. The fish was just a shade short of 10 pounds. And we went on shore and had a cup of tea, knowing we had the competition won. That's my most memorable brown trout. But to conclude, I will tell you, I only saw 1 trout ever in my lifetime that was larger than that trout. And that was on a winter's day when I was out on Lough Carra on a perfectly calm day. And I saw a fish in Tommy Heenan's Bay, a trout that was bigger than that 10-pound trout. There you are. That's my fishing story.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Tom Byrne, it's been absolutely fantastic chatting to you. I've learned so much about Lough Carra. I'm sure everybody listening to it has as well. It's another lake, or it's another fishery now that I have to put on my list to get out. And even just to see it, like, we put up pictures of the marl bottom, just to see that lake, just what makes it so unique and so special, I think will really hit home for listeners as to why people are so engaged with it. But Tom, thanks again for joining us.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Our thanks to Tom for joining us on the show. Don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.